Thank you for taking the time to join the show today to talk to me. I appreciate it,
Yeah,
man.
thanks.
How's it going? How
Thanks
are you
for
doing? How's your day going?
it's going all right. It's my first time on a stream like this, so
Oh, that's exciting.
very exciting. Day's
Yeah.
going all right. As you know, I work with the grind, and we have a big fundraiser coming up on Friday in Toronto, so we're kind of scrambling to get everything organized for that. But yeah, day's going all right. How about you?
Great. Yeah. Well, that's the thing. You got to watch out because you show up on one Twitch stream one day, and then like 5 years later, you find yourself still there and you can't leave and you can't get
Yeah,
away.
it sounds like a nightmare. So
Yeah,
I'm
you got
gonna
to
try
watch
to
out for
try to
that.
do my yeah.
You really got to watch out for that. Well, that's good to mention the thing at the on Friday with the grind. I've been talking about your piece
Mhm.
today and encouraging people to read that and subscribe to the grind. So, you
Appreciate
know,
that.
that would be cool for people to support. Obviously, it's doing a lot of important work,
Mhm.
which is why I wanted to talk to you about today. But do you just want to talk about this piece, which just came out yesterday, I believe, and just talk a
Yep.
little bit about what that's all about?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I've been reporting as much as I can over the past couple of years, almost 3 years, I guess, on sort of the Palestine solidarity movement in Toronto and across Canada. Whether that's like the Giller Prize protests or the Indigo protests, been following along pretty closely with a lot of this stuff and sort of like been reporting on the movement, attending events, and getting to know some of the organizers, getting to know some of the people who are involved, and police showing up to Palestine related events. It's many activists I talk to say that it's something that they essentially expect to happen um, anytime they put on events, even though there's very rarely any need for police, or it could be argued there's no need at all. Like these are very overwhelmingly peaceful legal events that take place. The only time there is kind of you know uh, uh, some issues is often when counter protesters show up and start to make a bit of a scene. That's when things can escalate a little bit. Um, but a lot of the time these are just peaceful protests or peaceful actions, but the police will sort of show up and either keep an eye from a distance or um, park their cars outside or maybe come out and speak to organizers, etc. So this is something that has been happening before. What made this story kind of what made the story interesting was a few things. First of all, the fact that these two occurrences happened on the same night on April 4th. The first tip we got was that there's something called Comedy Bar on Bloor Street in Toronto. This is just like one of the most well-known local comedy bars in Toronto. They have programming pretty much every night. A lot of local comedians. A lot of it's big part of the scene. And there's something called Stand Up for Gaza event series that's been going on for a couple of years now. It's run by a group called Comedians for Palestine, and every month they put on different comedians donate their time to tell some jokes and raise money for the Gaza Soup Kitchen. I believe they've done it 8 times or something like that. I'd have to double check, but I think they've raised like $10,000. And this is just like local comedians doing stand up at a at a Bloor Street bar in
Yeah.
Toronto. Pretty normal thing to happen in a city like this. On April 4th, when this show was just about to start, two police officers showed up, entered the lobby of Comedy Bar, and asked to see who the host was. This is not normal, right? This is like people are having drinks. It's a Saturday night. Police show up. That's not exactly comfortable for a lot of people. The host that evening was a guest host named Isabel, and I spoke to her. I wasn't at this event, but spoke to her, and she described kind of what went down. The police were saying that they were here to check up on what was going on at this gathering, and apparently they were under the impression that the people there were going to go march or something, or like take part in a protest of some sort. And this was 10 p.m. on a Saturday night in the rain, and for folks who go to
Yeah.
protest, that's not a typical time for a protest in the rain. But anyway, she had to speak to the officers and tell them this is a fundraiser, and eventually convince them to leave. But she was pretty shaken up by this. It's
Of
not fun
course.
to
Yeah.
to be to be approached by cops when you're just trying to get ready for a comedy set. And then, so, this was something we were looking into. And then I got another message from someone who was um, at the TIFF screening of Palestine 36, which, if in case people haven't heard of it, it's a movie that came out last year, Toronto International Film Festival. Pretty big movie, critically acclaimed. It was shortlisted for the Oscars. It's about the Arab revolt in 1936 against the British colonial powers. Um, that was at TIFF last fall, and they brought it back into the TIFF Lightbox, which is like the fancy theater downtown Toronto. And that same night, so April 4th, around 7:30, they were screening the movie to a sold out theater downtown Toronto. And I spoke to an organizer who was sitting watching the film near the bottom, and she tells me that the two cops literally entered, not just showed up in the lobby of TIFF, but actually entered into the theater itself while the movie was like midway through, which is not normal. I've never seen that before. She saw them kind of in the shadows looking at the audience, and she quickly confronted them and apparently kind of gave them a bit of hell, and tried to ask them what they were doing there. They told her that this was just normal. They were on a walkabout in the neighborhood and making sure everyone was safe. Again, this is just like completely out of uh, out of the ordinary. The person I spoke to, the organizer, has been doing events with TPFF, which is the Toronto Palestine Film Festival, and working with TIFF for 19 years. She puts on screenings multiple times a year, and she said she's never seen anything like that. And to be clear, she working with the Toronto Palestine Film Fest, she's seen cops show up at many of their events in the past, as I mentioned in the piece, but never entered the theater. So, this having these two things occur on the same day kind of just like pinged us a little bit, saying like, is this, we've seen this happening, but is something else happening here? And so I started speaking to some folks, and the what I kept hearing is, this isn't new, but it does seem to be potentially happening more aggressively, or at a higher rate, and not just at protests, but at events that are cultural. This is a movie. This is like you can go see this movie tonight.
Yeah. I mean, this is what
Yeah, and
this seems really like an escalation, because we're used to having
mhm,
police being marshaled to harass people that are engaged in actual activism,
mhm,
marches or encampments or anything like this. But this does seem like a relatively new phenomenon from what you're saying, what these organizers are saying, that these cultural events, stand up comedy shows, and film screenings,
mhm,
cops showing up to harass the people inside. Like that seems like a huge escalation right now.
I mean, I did speak to someone who works at a group called East End Acts. They're a group in the East End of Toronto, and they put on bi-monthly film screenings at the Redwood Theatre in Toronto. And they've also, in the past, had police show up to their screenings as well. So it's not brand new, but again, like you said, it does seem potentially like some sort of escalation. And why that seems plausible is the sort of ratcheting up of conversation around policing and anti-Semitism and hate crimes in Toronto. That people who've been following the news have seen a lot of conversation around this, right? Police being pressured to crack down on pro-Palestine movements. The Ontario government trying to stop the pro-Palestinian rallies. So we are seeing, there's a new counter-terrorism unit in Toronto that was related to shootings taking place at synagogues. So it's not inconceivable that like the police are ratcheting up their efforts, but at the same time, like these these organizers will tell you, what does that have to do with us? And so that's where, unfortunately for this article, the police have not responded to any of my questions about this. I asked them, why were you at the I'd love to know, what
Sure,
was it a
yeah.
call?
They could even
you
some
know
bullshit reason. I would be interested to hear what that was.
Yeah, some of the comedy folks said that maybe someone called the cops when they saw the marquee and just said, "Can you go check it out?" or said some false threat. We don't know, and they haven't answered. So that's kind of left us to speculate a little bit, if that makes sense. But obviously, this is raising some alarm bells because, um, you know, what at what point does something happen, or does this escalate when police show up? We know that police showing up to these types of events doesn't always end well. So that was sort of the way into this piece, and the fact that we couldn't get answers for what happened sort of pushed us into trying to speak to people about how are groups responding to this kind of thing, and how can we prepare for this type of thing.
Yeah, and I was kind of interested about the language that the police were using. Like, I know they can't give an actual answer to what they were doing, but the way this idea of like public safety is kind of weaponized here. You had this quote from Dania Majid, the TPFF
Mhm,
organizer, claiming, yeah, like you said, they're just doing this neighborhood walkabout,
mhm.
checking to see if everyone was safe.
Yeah.
And it's like this question of like whose safety is actually being protected here, and who's the one that's being intimidated. And it's like
Mhm,
using this
mhm.
idea of, oh, we're just trying to make sure everyone is okay and safe, while having armed people walking into these community events for this like kind of deliberately and intimidating and kind of provocative exercise.
Absolutely, and we know that, for a lot of folks, like, police showing up doesn't make people feel safer. For a lot of people, it makes them feel less safe, and, um, it the argument is that this is, is this some organizers told me that they see this as intimidation, careful what you're doing, careful what you say, and other people see it as, just sort of, almost like what was the word one of them used? Sort of giving the impression that, oh, we're taking care of this, like letting those who want to see more policing of these events know that they're taking care of it. Because it's worth pointing out that, like, what are the police going to do at a film screening? What are they going to do at a comedy event? You know what I mean? There's nothing. There's no illegal
Yeah.
activity here. What can the goal possibly be, right? Um, but we do know that there are resources being put towards this, and the fear is, and again, I have no way of determining this, so the fear is that perhaps police are being told, here's an event that is, here's a film screening, here's a comedy show, here's a play, go check it out, make sure there's a presence there. It's a pretty heavy implication if that's what's happening here.
Yeah, no, it really is. And yeah, we've talked about this weaponization of safety and these demands for the state to get involved in this. Like, and I guess, yeah, if there's this narrative that's being promoted right now about this anti-Zionist hate movement, which some prominent people in our both institutional and independent media have been out there promoting recently, it can create this kind of climate where the state is actually getting involved in any of these events, no matter the level of activism, even if it's a comedy show that's doing some fundraising for Gaza. And it is a really alarming trend, I think, that's
Mhm.
promoting this idea that any form of like anti-Zionist organizing, which is all being done in conjunction with these horrifying crimes that we've all been witnessing for now multiple years,
Mhm.
and any organization that's going in that's involved in countering that or supporting the people that are victimized by this violence are now being kind of like uh, lumped all together into this like scary hate movement, and then now the
Right.
armed agents of the state have to be involved in policing to make sure that people feel safe. It's just like
Mhm.
it's such a really troubling trend, and it's
Yeah,
it's
and you know,
scary.
you
It's scary for organizers and activists and everyone that's involved in these events.
Yeah, and without being told by the police what the answer is, why they're there, you'd look at the comments when people post about this stuff, or even my story. It's like, there's a lot of people who are saying, "Yeah, good, this is what we want." You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah,
it's very clear that this rhetoric is trickling down, and people are they are conflating any sort of anti-Zionist programming or with what they see as, uh, yeah. So, and I think part of this also stems back to the fact that, this piece that we wrote for the grind is making a bit of a splash. It's going around on social media, and I think, despite the fact that this is just like a tiny sliver of what's going on, I think that also points to the fact that, like, it shouldn't be independent media's job to report on this stuff. Like, there's like, but there has been a real, like, dearth of reporting in mainstream news on this stuff. You know what I mean? Um, and I think that that's kind of what this piece's impact is also showing, is like, people care about this. They want answers. They want police to be transparent. We live in a city where our police budget goes up every single year. It's currently at what, 1.43 billion dollars. I can't even say the amount so much, but
yeah,
and people, like, there needs to be some accountability, there needs to be some transparency. Like, is this why the police budget's going up? Is it so that we can have police patrolling these types of events? Like, what, you know what I mean? I think
yeah,
it's and so it's frustrating that the police aren't willing to respond to this and try to at least to give their take on it. But I think that this all also leads into, well, the second half of this piece, though, is that a lot of the organizers I spoke to said, we're not going to HR our way out of this. Like, we're not going to complain to the police, and they'll be like, "We're so sorry, we're not going to do this anymore." Like they really suggested that you need to be clear-eyed right now of where we are in this moment. It's There's always a risk of saying no to the war machine and no to genocide, and that there's always that there's going to be pushback. And rather than trying to really say, well, the police need to be better, it's about actually preparing, knowing your rights, knowing how to de-escalate, and just being really building relationships with venues who might know that the police show up. So that's what we tried to do with the second half of the story, was like, um, we can try to demand accountability from the police, but that's often an uphill battle that organizers aren't always don't always think is worth the effort.
Sure. And yeah, a couple things here, which is that I think it's obviously very frustrating for people like on the left or activists, this like ever rising police budget in a city that's whose mayor is kind of how touts her progressive credentials, and how no one, no matter what political tradition they kind of belong to or claim to belong to, seems to be able to ever do anything about this constant rise in police budgets, no matter what city that you live in. That's frustrating. It's frustrating that because I've been seeing a lot of pieces in the media or little, tweets or whatever about Canada Post, and Canada Post has lost this much money each year. Talking about Canada Post, a public service, as it's this business, as if it's a business that's supposed to be turning a profit,
Yeah,
where this logic does not get applied to our vast security apparatus and their multi-billion-dollar budgets in these major cities. So
exactly.
it's like the way we talk about public services, and when we want to destroy one public service like Canada Post, it gets talked about in this way, but no one's ever talking about, whether the police makes money or loses money.
Yeah, exactly. And and there is another piece in the grind. It's our current cover story, actually, if you see the physical paper out in the city. But by Aliyah Pabani wrote a piece about the police budget in Toronto going up. And another point she made is that this is occurring whether or not crime is decreasing or increasing, right? It's not like the crime is going out of control and that's how
Yeah,
we got to spend more money. It's like even the justifications they're making doesn't seem to impact whether or not the budget goes up or down. And so I think it does matter how media talks about these things, right? And like you said, if we're talking about, yeah, the way we frame one service versus another, the way that we talk about, what is Olivia Child's reasons for saying yes to this budget, and especially given this, we're in this moment where, like, just a few months ago we were exposed to one of the biggest police corruption scandals in the history of Toronto police. And you know obviously the media was all over that, and covered it very extensively, but not always the analysis of, okay, but why did we just did how much of this was known before the police budget just got increased again? And you know
would
what I
you mind?
mean?
Would you
And
mind just expanding actually a little bit on the police corruption story that came out, because not all of the listeners or viewers might be familiar with it.
so in February, it was 8 Toronto police officers were charged in one of the largest cases of police corruption in Canadian history. These officers were charged with leaking confidential police information to people involved in organized crime. So they were using databases that were, only for police officers and only for certain police officers. They were using those databases to find, confidential information that they would give to gang members. And this resulted in like gang shootings, extortion, and most kind of infamously, it was a plot to murder a correction officer. So that was what kind of broke the story. From what I understand, I think there was like
Yeah.
a very high level corrections officer in like the largest maximum prison, or one of the largest maximum prison detention centers in Ontario. There was a hit that was foiled by the police on this corrections officer, and they ended up finding out that how did these people get this officer's address. And it turns out they traced it back to a police officer who ended up having a really cozy relationship with someone who was really deep in organized crime. So I think I'm summarizing that pretty good.
Yeah, no, that sounds about right. Well, it's
Yeah,
fortunately this kind of crossover between organized crime and the police. I think we can safely say that was an isolated incident that we've never heard of
no,
before or
yeah,
since.
couple bad apples.
Yeah, there's a couple bad apples. Let's give them another couple billion, and they can root out the corruption, and we're gonna get back to the way things should be. No, but you mentioned Alia Pabani. I know she's done a lot of commentary and research about like you mentioned this kind of like rash of mostly unexplained shootings and attacks on like infrastructure at night. Um, Often we don't need to speculate too much on that. But one thing I have noticed is kind of interesting is you know as the news cycle starts to drift towards violence in Gaza or things that the Israeli government is doing, inevitably we'll end up having this conversation about this like dangerous climate or anti-Semitism or these kinds of attacks on synagogues or restaurants or whatever it is.
Hmm.
And then that kind of the news cycle just ends up focusing more on that than like the actions of the Israeli government or anything
Hmm.
that's like feeding into this anti-Zionist movement in this country.
Hmm.
And one thing I've noticed though is kind of interesting is that like in after these incidents, you'll have these demands for the police to get involved. And like, what is Mark Carney doing? What is Olivia Chow doing? We need more police. We need police at all these synagogues, and we need police at all these locations, and we need to crack down on this kind of scary climate.
Hmm.
And then so these demands are made at one point, but then when this police presence does show up, and you do have police showing up, you mentioned this new like counterterrorism task force that's being created,
Hmm.
and you do have police showing up to these events, and then that gets held up as an example of the scary climate that look at what's happened in this country now. There's police at all these events and synagogues, and it becomes this like weird like self-reinforcing thing where there's these demands for police
Hmm.
presence at these events, and then the police presence is used as an example of the scary climate that we're supposed to be talking about. Is that said? Have you noticed that
Yeah, and I mean
cycle?
the thing is like there's the data that shows that, and even the police will stand by some of this data that like when in December the Ontario Solicitor General sent an open letter calling on the police to crack down on the pro-Palestine movement, and even the chief of Toronto Police was like, we are already like we're like, what are you talking about? You know what I mean? And we're already doing this. And then they point to the number of people they've arrested at these rallies, but then people who are tracking this will say, well, actually, all those people arrested, none of them were convicted. Like most of those charges were dropped. There was never enough evidence. You know what I mean? So it just becomes, like you said, this sort of like cycle of the same sort of conversation and the same sort of media storm, when in reality, it's not like we're getting to the root of what's happening with these synagogue shootings. You know what I mean? And if we
Oh,
haven't learned more from what I can tell about what's going on, and we haven't either seen any evidence that connects it to like the organized pro-Palestine movement. So it does become this really frustrating cycle. And like you said, it distracts from what the crimes that people are out on the streets protesting in the first place, and by conflating these things. And that's what as a journalist, I always try to keep these things separate, because as local journalists, if a synagogue is shot at, of course we need to look at that and investigate that and see what's happening. But like that has nothing to do with civilians being carpet bombed in Gaza, or Israel invading Lebanon and displacing people. And these are conversations that people are having and connecting to Canadian policies. And yeah, the sort of attempt to conflate them it's become so, to me, I think it's become so transparent to most Canadians. And I feel like the way that the media the media hasn't caught up with the way people in the streets are thinking about
yeah.
these things. Do you agree with me? Like you're maybe a little more involved in speaking to like outside of the media, but like that seems to be the sense that I get, is that people aren't falling for it. They see through these efforts.
Yeah, I do. I've definitely noticed a really growing disconnect. If you look at like polling or like people's opinions about this,
Mm,
there does seem to be like a growing discrepancy or a disconnect between the priorities of what the media is talking about
mm,
versus like the reality that people can see and experience for themselves. The thing I always talk about, people are probably tired of hearing about it because I bring it up every time this conversation comes up, was the Spider-Man incident. Um, when the man dressed
mm,
as Spider-Man waved a Palestinian flag outside Mount Sinai Hospital for 5 minutes. And I know the Grind did a lot of important coverage on that, actually
yeah,
talking about that and
yeah.
debunking that story. That's something I wanted to talk about because the Grind specifically has, I think, carved out a really important place right now where this kind of commentary can happen, and this
Hmm.
kind of counter narrative can exist to what's going
Hmm.
on in Canadian media. Um, but as someone like you've been a part of like more typical mainstream media outlets in this country as well, so I was just
Hmm.
wondering from your perspective, like what it's been like going to be in more of an independent journalist and working at places like The Grind and freelancing versus what your experience was. You don't need to get too into the details or whatever. I don't need to get in trouble or anything like that. But your experience, trying to work within this system of mainstream media versus like what the difference has been working at a place like The Grind or just being independent in general.
Mhm. Yeah, I think what I like to say about Canadian mainstream media, having spent some time there, is that there's a very narrow lane what's considered um, acceptable discourse or around this specific issue,
Yes.
and it's very very difficult to edge out of that lane, and it takes and it's very possible. There's a lot of folks who are really pushing and trying to tell the stories that they want people to. Yeah, but when you do try to push out their lane, there's a lot of resistance, and there's a lot of attacks from um, pro-Israel lobby groups, and it's very exhausting to try to tell the stories of specifically the pro-Palestine movement in a sort of nuanced way. So a lot of the time when you see reporting from
Yeah.
mainstream media on protests or on the movement, it's always done in a very sort of like, we are just these kind of aliens who have dropped down to earth observing from a mile away, and these people are saying one slogan, and these people say that slogan is racist, and the police said this, and very rarely, and there's also like a real um, aversion to speaking with organizers or speaking with activists who often in mainstream media are seen as or considered sort of not trustworthy, or they have too much of an agenda, even though they'll happily speak to CIJA or a pro-Israel group, which is also has a very straightforward agenda, but activists are seen as also having an agenda, therefore we can't speak to them. So anyway, you sort of end up a lot of the time when you read mainstream reporting on something like the Spider-Man scandal, or these stories will just be so clunky and sort of like, it's so obvious that there's trying to be this almost feigned sense of objectivity, and balance that just doesn't really make sense, and it ends up making the story just almost confusing. Sometimes you'll read those stories and you'll read 1,000 words and you'll walk away being more confused about what happened than when you started. And I think what's been nice working in independent media, where we're less concerned about pushback from lobby groups or from investors or from readers. Like we a lot of time independent media has a real sort of willingness to tell the story the way they want it to be told, and that's not to say that we forego any sense of journalistic integrity or objectivity when it's required. But with the Spider-Man story, what the Grind did, I wasn't there at the time, but what David Gray Donald, who wrote the piece, did was just break down
Yeah.
what actually happened. This is what actually happened. We don't need we're not going to get the police version first and then the lobby group second and the activist group. We're actually going to go to these events and break down what happened, and we're actually going to speak to people who were there, and we're not going to be so there's a sense, and there's also a willingness to take as a starting, when we report on these things, there's a willingness to take as a starting point that there is a genocide taking place in Palestine, and that the Israeli state is responsible for that, and like just having that starting point changes how you're going to approach a story about a movement that's in solidarity with the victims of a genocide. You know what I'm saying here? Like, whereas
For
a lot of
sure.
the time with mainstream media, you have to start from this space where that's considered a contested position, and you know what I mean, and therefore you just end up sort of going through these hoops, and you sort of end up missing the broader pictures. It's also just nice to report as a reporter, to just like not to have that fear of uh, being told this story is not worth. I don't know, just
Yeah, of
just
course.
being able to trust your reporting and trust your sources without having to justify it or jump through hoops, or get a call from the managing editor minutes before it's going to go up saying we have a problem here. Those things really scare a lot of good reporters off from telling these stories the way that they know they should be told.
Sure. Yeah, and it's interesting the way that like ideology functions when it comes to journalism and media in the country, right? Where
Mhm.
anyone that has like you said, coming from a position of understanding that the genocide is happening or being willing to engage with activism,
Mhm.
that automatically, oh, you've got some kind of like ideological slant, and therefore
Mhm.
it's not trustworthy, therefore it's not real journalism, but just like reprinting a police press release or a CJA press release, or saying, just taking at face value anything the government's saying. No ideology involved there. That's just pure journalism. That's just calling balls and strikes.
Mhm.
And you see the way that like the invisible ideology functions there, and
Mhm.
people that are immersed in this mainstream media ecosystem get really confused by that, I think. Um,
Yeah, especially in Canada. You look at the United States as an example, and obviously media in the United States is not perfect. Mainstream media in the United States is not perfect, but there does that lane that I mentioned of discourse is much wider, and that's just a function of being a bigger country. But there are all sorts of media outlets that are speaking uh, you know, outside of that lane and are doing bold reporting and ambitious reporting and challenging the mainstream discourse in really interesting ways. And in Canada, our mainstream media is all quite similar when it comes down to it. And I think that's why a lot of time you see some of the best journalists in Canada who want to write about certain issues just write for American outlets. You know what I mean? But that
yeah,
is being challenged by a lot of the independent um, outlets in Canada that are cropping up, and a lot of them are really scrappy, and a lot of them are working with limited funding. But that space, I think, is becoming increasingly important, and increasingly people are turning to it. You know what I mean? Which is, I think, yeah. This is a story that the one that we published yesterday that I had friends in mainstream media who said, I can't believe we're not covering this. You know what I mean?
yeah,
It should be an obvious thing to cover, but it's falling on these less resourced independent outlets. So
yeah. And just to like to tie it back to this piece, I think that's one of the big discrepancies that I think I and others have noticed, which is why I think more people are both looking to independent media to get actual answers about this and being involved in it, like you and
mhm,
I are. But just the way that we talked about student encampments or marches or even just
mhm,
comedy shows or film screenings are described as just being kind of inherently dangerous and
mhm,
contributing to this scary climate, and need the police presence involved and need armed agents of the state to come in and intimidate these people. Whereas, and even like progressive outlets will fall into this trap also, not to name any specifics, but like if there's going to be like a pro-Israel march, as there was a couple months ago in Toronto, and the way that that gets talked about, even in more traditionally left-wing media, and is described as like, oh, non-violent, and there's not this need for the police presence to get
mhm,
involved or to monitor these people or to go and check in all these different communities where these marches are going past to make sure everyone's okay, even
mhm,
though these protesters, even if they might be described as nonviolent, are out there in support of a gay army that's currently engaged in like mass murder and torture and all these like horrifying crimes. And the way that doesn't get framed in our media as being inherently dangerous or inherently scary or violent in the way that
mhm,
like a comedy show or a
mhm,
film screening is.
mhm,
Like it is completely backwards. And like I said, I think a growing number of people
mhm.
are becoming increasingly alarmed by this discrepancy, which is why I'm glad that you're out there doing the work you're doing and the grind is doing that. And yeah, this piece I think is really important. I hope more mainstream media outlets do start picking up on this because it is a really important story.
Yeah, I appreciate that a lot. Response we're seeing, people are excited to just have alternatives, and so really appreciate you boosting the story and sharing it with your listeners.
Yeah, of course, it's my pleasure, Richie. Well, I know you didn't have too much time, but I do appreciate you were able to come on here and talk to me. Uh,
And,
Pleasure as always.
yeah, anytime, anytime. Hit me up again. I'd love to come back on and chat.
Just to be clear, though, you don't hear that noise, that chiming sound. Just to
I don't
be
hear
totally
anything.
clear.
It sounds
Wonderful.
crystal clear for me. Yeah.
Good. Because about every 45 seconds while we've been talking, I've been hearing this weird sound and I don't know how to get rid of it. And it's making me want to.
That might be in your head, Rob. It might be
Oh,
something
no,
that might be.
he's
Yeah,
gaslighting me now. Oh, my
yeah,
God.
yeah.
Okay, Richie, thanks so much for coming on the show, man.
Cheers.
I'll talk to you soon.
All right. See you guys.